Good afternoon, everyone. Today is April 25th, 2023. It's 1 p.m. and this is a City of Prescott study session. Roll call, please.
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Here.
Councilwoman Kentelme.
Here.
Councilman Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Rusing.
Here.
Councilman Sishka.
Here.
And Councilman Tenney.
Yes.
All are present.
Well, we have two items on our agenda today. The first one is item 3A, presentation and discussion regarding an update on commercial air service at Prescott Regional Airport, Ernest A. Love Field.
Hello, Council and Mayor. I'm Robin Sabata, the Airport Director, and I have the pleasure of presenting Mike Mooney with Volair Aviation. To give you a little background, he first came into the Prescott airspace back in about 2017. Mayor Oberg found him, and he was doing some great work for an airport up north. And so he said, come on down and consider doing a leakage study. So he conducted a leakage study of the Prescott area. That leakage study was presented ultimately to SkyWest Airlines. And as a result of that, on April 13th, it was Friday the 13th of 2018, SkyWest Airlines was very pleased with us and indicated an interest in bidding on air service at Prescott. Ultimately, they did win the air service bid, and that bid lasted for approximately 2 years. After that, they came back and rebid us, and that was for an additional 3 years. Now, in the first bid cycle, there were 7 bidders. On the second bid cycle, there was only 1 bidder, and it was SkyWest. We're now in the third bid cycle, and Mr. Mooney will be here to tell us what's happening in the industry and also how it's going to potentially impact what's happening here locally in Prescott.
Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon, Council. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate taking a few moments to speak with you. I've got about 29 slides, so I'll try to keep you awake, and we'll walk through these slides. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. What do I point it at?
Press the down button.
The down button. There we go. I pushed the up button. Oh, well.
Did.
Yeah. So that picture there, oh, wait a minute. Did I go too far? Yeah, I did. Come on, baby. Well, it won't. All right. My fingers are too. No. Can't get it to.
There we go.
There it, oh.
I will be your Mr.
There it is. All right. This may take longer than we thought. First of all, I'll give you an overview of the airline industry in general, U.S. domestic. Then we'll zoom in and take a look at the state of Arizona. And then we'll zoom in further and look at Prescott. And then finally, we'll talk about the bid cycle. All right. Let's see if it'll go 6 slides or not. Boy, this thing's delicate. All right, we're going to skip that pilot's. God, this thing is really delicate. It's all right.
I will do it.
You're going to have to.
Sure, no problem.
All right. Let's see if we can find 1,
so we're gonna go
2,
here.
3.
Good enough?
All right, if that's the next one. Number 3? Is that 3? See, you're having trouble with it, too.
Yeah, it's great.
Number 3 right there.
Yeah.
Why don't we just do that? Can we do next? Is he in there?
Next slide.
Next slide.
All right, here we go. All right, the pilot shortage that exists in this country right now, today, drives every single airline planning, route, schedule, decision. That's how bad the situation is. The regional carriers, such as SkyWest, they are hit the hardest. But even the mainline carriers and the ULCCs, and forgive me for my abbreviations, every industry has them. ULCC means ultra low cost carrier. That's carriers like Allegiant, Frontier, Spirit, the ones with the $49 fare, but then there's the add-ons and the add-ons, but it's still, okay, those are ULCCs. Anyway, everybody is struggling with pilots, even American Delta United. The retirement curve of the current pilot population is still ahead of the qualified new hire curve. We're going in the wrong direction, frankly. Also, One of the nuances that doesn't get covered in the press, or it's very difficult to explain, but I'll try, pilot productivity is down from pre-COVID. Now, part of that is COVID did impacts on our society, and some of them have been work-related, and one of them is work productivity among pilots. Pilots simply don't bid their schedules and look for work the same way they did at their employer in 2019. So if you had 5,000 pilots doing a certain schedule in 2019, it would take 5,100 or 5,200 to fly the same schedule in 2023. So we've got a productivity decline going on for a variety of reasons. Context on all this challenge is traffic is actually finally up over 2019 when we do the month over from pre-pandemic. March is up 1% and actually 12% versus last year. Leisure travel demand has more than fully recovered in the United States. Folks got money and folks are traveling. However, there are fundamental shifts in business travel and how business travel is conducted. And the road warriors in our country, the guys and gals that travel 4 times a month, well, they're now traveling 2 times a month. And the other 2 times they're doing a Teams call or a Zoom call or something like that. That fundamentally changes the formula for business travel and for airlines that cater to business travel. Just to show you what's going on with fares, if you've traveled recently, you've probably noticed this part. Average domestic fare is up 27% in fourth quarter of 22 versus fourth quarter of 21, and it's up even 15% from 2019. So we're paying more money to get on the airplane. Oil prices, I just checked this morning, is about $77 a barrel of oil this morning. It was $105 last year this time. That was due to the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, and there was a spike in oil prices at that time. And actually, oil's up about 11, 12, 13 bucks from where it was in 2019. So that cost metric is up for the airlines. Next slide. Pilot salaries are soaring. As you might assume, when you have a labor shortage, people with that skill set get paid more money, and more power to them. There's no problem with that. Even some of the regional airlines.
Sir, I'm sorry to cut you off. I need you to speak into the microphone, please.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I need you to speak into the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? Is that better?
Into the microphone.
Okay, right there.
There you go.
All right. Okay, now I got it. Thank you. Pilot salaries are soaring. We even have regional airlines paying 6-figure signing bonuses to get pilots on board. That's how bad it is. One of the results of that is that the network airlines, logically with the pilot shortage, they're retiring the smallest airplanes they have. If you're going to pay pilots a lot of money, you might as well put them in bigger airplanes. So we're seeing the 50-seat regional jets being dramatically, the fleet being reduced in the industry. American Airlines, for example, has eliminated all 50-seat aircraft at Dallas-Fort Worth. And if any of you have ever been there, you know how large the American operation is at DFW, 1,000 flights a day. No more 50-seaters in that entire American operation. Delta is down 1% of their domestic flights are 50-seaters in May of this year versus 4% less than a year ago. United's 50-seat operation is down 21%. Some 50-seat regional jets are being converted to 30-seat regional jets, which can operate under more generous pilot regulations. However, we need to understand that's really a bridging mechanism. The 50-seat fleet is 20, 25 years old. It's got another 5 to 10 years in it, but it doesn't have another 20 years in it. So even the 30-seat product that some carriers are coming out with is a bridging exercise. It's not a long-term solution. So since 2020, because of all this and reducing small aircraft fleets in the network carriers, 74 cities in the United States have been terminated by network carriers. Americans terminated 19, Delta 17, United 38. Over a dozen cities have lost everything, all their air service since 2020. Smaller cities are confronted with a paradox, a challenge, a problem. We're either going to have to support 65 to 76 seat RJs, or we're going to end up with 30 seat or 9 seat RJs. There's no gap in the middle there. The 50 seat is going to turn into a dinosaur. Next slide. This is a kind of complicated chart, probably for study later, but it illustrates the decline of 50-seat operations. The type of aircraft that flies at Prescott is the 50-seat aircraft. This illustrates the acceleration of those aircraft being removed. What I've done there is taken American, Delta, United, they're color-coded. At the bottom is the combination of all three. And what you see there is their number of flight hours. They're going to fly their domestic fleet by type. In other words, mainline means the Airbuses and the Boeings, the big aircraft. Dual class means the 70-seat RJs, and the 50-seat is highlighted in red. How many hours they scheduled in July of 2022, October, January of 23, and May of 23, from left to right, and the change in the number of hours they're allocating to that type of aircraft for that month. And as you can see highlighted in red, they are rapidly getting rid of their 50-seat fleets. So that is the kind of challenge that Prescott faces. It's a challenge you are not alone in. It's going on all over the country. This challenge, this problem is occurring. Next slide. Arizona Air Service. I tried to put a picture there of all the airlines that serve Arizona. I probably missed one or two, but next slide. This chart, I do this type of presentation all over the country, and you have a better chart than most states do. As you can see, prior to pandemic, your domestic traffic, your annual traffic in the state was in a steady climb, and then came 2020, and the world changed in terms of the pandemic and shutting down travel and all that kind of stuff. Arizona's recovery has been better than most states. And 2022, you actually recovered to generate more traffic in this state, air traffic, than you did in 2019. Most states are not there yet. Next slide. Airport trends. These are traffic trends. This is domestic traffic by airport in the state, 2021 versus 2022. And my mapper, and I have an incredible person who does my mapping, she kind of sized all the airports and color-coded them. The red airports, including Prescott, are the EAS airports in the state, Show Low and Page, and then the medium-sized airports, and then the large airports. And of course, Phoenix Sky Harbor is the gigantic airport in your state. So as you can see, when you look at Prescott, traffic, reported domestic traffic actually up 8%. Flagstaff actually down 23%. And that's no comment on Flagstaff's economy. It's a comment on the fact that American has cut back service at Flagstaff, and United actually pulled out of Flagstaff.
Mayor Pro Tem, you have a question?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I just ask a quick
Sure.
clarifying question here? When you say domestic traffic, is this commercial traffic?
Yes.
Okay, I just
Yeah.
want to make sure I was.
Yeah. It's airline enplanements and deplanements by airport.
So this wouldn't include training flights?
No. Just ticketed passengers paying to get on an airliner.
Thank you.
And it's only domestic, not international.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, state traffic up 16% year over year, and that's driven by largely Sky Harbor up 15. Whatever Sky Harbor does is probably statistically what'll show up for the state because of its dominance. And then, as I noted, Prescott up 8, Flagstaff down 23. Next slide. So let's look at the same measure of seat capacity, 2021 versus 2022. So in other words, how many airline seats did airlines offer at each airport for year 21 versus year 22, domestic again, not counting international flights. State capacity up 6%. If you noticed lately that your flight is more crowded, well, remember we said that traffic was up 16%, seat count's only up 6. So load factors, the number of flights that are full or heavily loaded, has gone way up. The industry is maximizing the situation with fuel prices up and pilot costs up. Overall capacity in the state up 6%. Prescott is down 7%. I'm sorry, down 17%, and that's with SkyWest cutting back 50-seat flights here because of the pilot shortage. Flagstaff down 28. The other airports in the state, other than Phoenix Mesa, doing quite well. Next slide. We just performed a catchment leakage study for Prescott to define the catchment area and what kind of traffic's going on. Next slide. So what we do when we do one of these studies is we talk to the airport and set up what we call a catchment area in terms of zip codes. Now, given your geographic location, we want to be very respectful of Phoenix and the fact that the closer you get to Phoenix, the more likely you're going to drive to Phoenix, Sky Harbor, or Mesa. You're not going to come to Prescott. So our catchment area is kind of short on the south end and yet kind of extended on the north end. The key here, though, is that the way the landscape lays out in Arizona, outside of Prescott and the valley here and Sedona and Flagstaff, the catchment area is relatively thinly populated. So whether or not a zip code way up north is included is not pivotal because probably not that much traffic generated. So we looked at 40 zip codes and north to include Flagstaff. We sampled ARC tickets. Again, there's another acronym. ARC is Airline Reporting Corporation. In other words, many airlines report their tickets and their ticket sales to a certain clearinghouse in Washington, D.C., and you can sample that data, which is what we do. We buy that data. So we take a look at that data plus the Department of Transportation data, and we extrapolated that your catchment area is about 1 million passengers for year 2022. Now, when you look at what Flagstaff boarded and what Prescott boarded, well, that means a whole lot of people are driving to Phoenix because we didn't do 1 million passengers in those two airports. For the catchment area, domestic travel is about 96%, international 4%, and Sky Harbor captured 82% of the traffic. Phoenix Mesa 5.5, Flagstaff 5.5, Prescott 4.6, and Las Vegas 2.3. Next slide. This is a little bit busy. I hope you can read it. The Los Angeles Basin is number one among catchment destinations. So for the folks, the 1 million people got on and off airplanes, 61,000 of them were going to or from LA Basin, meaning LAX, Orange County, Ontario, Burbank, Long Beach, those airports. The Bay Area was number two. So the affinities between Prescott and California are very, very clear. Seattle number 3, Denver number 4. 5 of the top 15 were West Coast markets, the LA Basin, Bay Area, Sacramento, Seattle, and Portland. Next slide. Airport of use, we already touched on that. Phoenix International or Sky Harbor, 82%. Mesa, just under 6%, Flagstaff under 6%. For international travel, it shifts a little bit. The little box down at the far right, Phoenix Sky Harbor 65%, Las Vegas 27%. So a little bit of a shift there. Next slide. Airline of use, council members. How many of you have an American frequent flyer card?
I used to.
How many of you have a Southwest frequent flyer
I
card?
used to have one of those too.
Okay. Those are the dominant carriers. Those are the dominant carriers in the state of Arizona. Those two, between the two of them, they're 2/3 of all airline traffic in the state is either American or Southwest. But you can see the breakdown there on domestic traffic. United and Delta, Allegiant, Alaska, Frontier. The low-cost carriers, the ULCCs that I talked about, in your catchment area, among those 1 million people, about 11% were low-cost carriers. So about, according to that math, 110,000 of that 1 million people got on Allegiant or Frontier or Spirit Airlines. Next slide. So let's boil down to Prescott itself, your air service. Next slide. This is a history of your airline service traffic by year. Off there on the far left were the wonderful days of Great Lakes Airlines, as you all reminisce repeatedly about how wonderful. Yeah, he's shaking his head no. Do recall in 2010, 13 years ago, Alaska Air was actually in here with turboprops flying to LAX at the time. And then you see the very poor traffic results for Great Lakes. They couldn't exploit the incredible opportunity, which is your market. We were lucky enough to get SkyWest in here, and obviously you can see the dramatic results of that with only 2 flights a day, one to LA, one to Denver. Next slide. Average fare. You've probably noticed that fares have gone up. Well, this kind of chart confirms that. Now, this is a measure of domestic one-way average fare by market, net of taxes, fees, TSA fees, fuel surcharges, whatever charges, just net fare. That's what the DOT measures with the airline, so that's what we chart. So if you're used to paying 500 something round trip, well, take the number up there, multiply by 2, and then add the taxes and the PFC, and you come up with that number. Anyway, as you can see, Flagstaff has a average domestic fare right now in the $300 one-way category. And Prescott's number is actually somewhat below that. Phoenix Network means Phoenix, American Delta, United, the big 3 network carriers. And the blue line is Southwest Airlines at Phoenix, and the black line is Mesa Airport, in other words, Allegiant Air at Mesa, with their 1 million+ passengers a year. Next slide. What I like to do for my airline partners is I like to project traffic visually. So we do what we call bubble maps. This is a bubble map of your domestic traffic year 2022. The bubbles are weighted by volume. And as you can see, California is primary, up the West Coast there, Denver, Texas, the Great Lakes region, Florida, Northeast Corridor. Pretty typical distribution for a Southwest United States city, probably a little heavier California, as we already discussed. Next slide. Another thing I like to do is a starburst. So this is every one-stop connection your folks did over Denver. Now, this is not weighted for volume. So in other words, Fargo, North Dakota didn't have the same number of people as Chicago or something like that. It just shows all the places folks connected over Denver. Next slide. This is all the places domestically folks connected over LAX. As you can see, there's some backhaul that goes on there. Folks fly to LA and then connect all the way to the East Coast, sometimes in 2022. Next slide. Essential Air Service Program. Okay, now we're going to get down into the weeds about the program that funds your air service. Next slide. This is a chart I keep up of the Essential Air Service Program, lower 48 United States. The red line is the amount of subsidy money the government put out for that year. The blue line is that number divided by the number of cities. So you get the average subsidy per city at the bottom there in blue. The yellow boxes are the number of cities that were in the program that year. And as you can see in 2013 versus 2022, 6 cities have fallen out of the program. The subsidy amount that the government's obligated has gone up 65% in 10 years. And I just couldn't put it in this report, but just yesterday the DOT issued the May 2023 report that $363 million annual obligation is $394 million as of May of 23. Subsidy rates are soaring all over the country. Next slide. Yeah.
Could you explain to them where the subsidy comes from?
Oh, sure. Go back, please. Thank you. Robin asked me to explain where the subsidy money comes from. Congress, When an American airline flies from the United States to Germany, they fly over England. When they fly over England, the English air traffic control system charges the United States, that airline, some money to use their airspace. When Air France takes off from Paris and goes to Mexico City, they fly over the U.S. Air France pays us overfly fees. Congress mandated that a specific amount of overfly fees is put aside for the EAS program. So that's where some of the subsidy money comes from. The rest of it comes from the general DOT FAA budget that's, done every year. Unfortunately, international travel has declined. And unfortunately, the subsidies are soaring. So the contribution of overfly fees is actually a smaller percentage of the total than it used to be. There just aren't as many Air France airplanes going from Paris to Mexico City, and our subsidy rates are going up. Next slide. Significant shifts in EAS, and I told you you're not alone in the challenges we face right now today. Because of the pilot shortage, Essential Air Service is now basically 9-seat single-engine airplanes or regional jets. The old days of having 30-seat turboprops, those are gone. You can't find any pilots to sit in those airplanes. SkyWest, prior to the pandemic, had rapidly expanded their EAS portfolio, and they had 49 out of the 111 cities, and did a great job in all of them. When the pilot shortage really hit in late 21, SkyWest did a strategy shift. They made a choice, just like American Delta United did with 50-seaters. They're going to exit the 50-seat fleet, and they're going to shift away from operating their 50-seat aircraft in that fleet. They filed in March of 2022 to exit 31 of their 49 EAS cities. Now, their intention was to rebid them with a 30-seat airplane, not a 50-seat airplane. And the plan eventually for SkyWest, they will tell you, is to impose this on all 40 plus of their EAS cities. The little box there shows the carriers that play in EAS in year-end 21, year-end 22, and how that's shifted among the carriers. Next slide. To show you you're not alone, in March of 2022, these cities all got filed on by SkyWest. You guys dodged the bullet at the time because you're a very good performing market. I was a very busy person 13 months ago because 12 of those cities were my clients up there. So it was a busy time. Of the 31 cities that were filed on, and 12 of them chose to go with a different carrier, go in a different direction, leave SkyWest. SkyWest also has 14 cities in Delta EAS. They're going to do the same thing there. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. The future of EAS. The department has told me they're planning $500 million, $500 million for the program next fiscal 24. The pilot shortage and fuel cost spike is damaging EAS economics. It appears that the 30-seat RJs will replace the 50-seat RJs in most EAS cities. And again, that's a bridging exercise. Those 50-seat/30-seat aircraft are 20-some years old right now. 10 years from now, they'll be 30 years old. Now, a 20-year-old airplane is not like a 20-year-old car, but nevertheless, at some point at 30 years, maybe the extra maintenance causes a need to retire. 30-seat economics on a 50-seat platform require more subsidy. In other words, the 50-seat platform with 30 seats still burns the same fuel. The mechanics that work on the aircraft still need the same salary, ground crew, flight attendant, etc. There is some buzz in the industry about electrifying aircraft. The technology is really limited to the smaller aircraft. So the little 9-seat turboprops might emerge in a couple years with batteries. Now, that's going to improve their economics, but their economics will still be poor. relative to larger aircraft types. Recent EAS rebids that have occurred in other cities, the subsidy levels have escalated double, sometimes triple what they were. For cities subject to what's called the $200 cap, are you familiar with the fact that you have to make a subsidy divided by passengers should be less than $200 in your city because of proximity to Phoenix? There's a lot of cities in the program that are what we call 200 cap cities. Many of those cities are going to bust the cap in fiscal 24 because the subsidy rates have gone up and the traffic hasn't gone up proportionally. So it's possible as we go forward, the DOT may tighten criteria on EAS to
So,
try and...
Mike, what happens when that happens? Do they lose their EAS subsidies?
Very good question, Mr. Mayor. What happens is the DOT fiscal year 24 ends. The DOT takes a few months to look at the data as it comes in. If you busted cap, you get a notice of termination. You busted cap, we're going to terminate you. And then there's a paragraph that says, however, you can file for a waiver. Pre-pandemic, they were granting waivers relatively generously, only cutting a few really weak performing cities every year. During the pandemic, everybody got a waiver. Everybody got a free ride, including this year. Fiscal 24, they're going to go back to enforcing. My suspicion is they're going to have like 35 cities bust cap. Politically, it'll probably be impossible for them to just terminate 35 cities. My suspicion is they will be reasonable and generous on waivers. All you have to do is make your business case. Here's what we're going to do to come into compliance. It'll take us 2 years, whatever. So I want to point out that situation. I don't want you to think that's some sort of imminent crisis. It's not. And again, if it happens, you're not going to be alone. There'll probably be 36 cities in term notice. April of 25 is when it'll come up, probably. Prescott is one of the larger volume EAS cities in the whole program. And I do want to point out, if you, again, recall the fond days of Great Lakes Airlines, if you regress to 9 seats, the traffic's going to decline. Making cap with 9-seat airplanes is virtually impossible. The math just doesn't work. Next slide. So the pending EAS bid. Next slide. The RFP, request for proposals, will come out April 28th. Bids will be due probably 30 days later. They usually give 30 days, so it'll be around Memorial Day. SkyWest has indicated they love Prescott, but they're going to propose their 30-seat product. We are actively recruiting other carriers. There aren't a lot of options out there, but I'm working hard for you. The goal is to retain RJs. Current contract technically expires August 31. However, the DOT is badly backlogged on bid cycles all over the country. So they'll be held in. You're not going to have a new contract or a new carrier by August 31. It ain't going to happen. So probably if there's a new carrier, it'll be year end, December or even January of 24. Next slide. Oh, yeah, Robin just wanted me to, hold in means that SkyWest will continue to fly what they're flying until the new bid is resolved. So finally, the bid cycle. EAS has become basically RJs or 9-seaters. You're not going to perform well with a 9-seater. It's essential, in my professional opinion, to retain RJs. The pilot shortage is a long-term issue. It's not going to solve in 2 years or anything like that. Pilot pay will continue to increase during the shortage. Carriers will want pilots in larger airplanes, not smaller ones. So long-term, retaining the RJs, in my opinion, requires the longer runway to eliminate the ongoing heat-related seat blocks and allow for a more efficient operation of large RJs. Next slide, yeah, that's it. So you want to go back one? All right, good. I'll stay right there. I'm complete on the presentation. Questions, comments, discussion?
You know, Mike, I understand that Flagstaff has lost their commercial aircraft capability there, and they only have now a small commuter flights down to Sky Harbor. So is that accurate? And if so, what might that impact be on Prescott picking up some of those passengers?
I believe that they've had cutbacks, but I believe they still have dual-class regional jets, Phoenix, and I believe they still have a Dallas flight. But United left. They exited the market. But as we showed, their capacity is down substantially.
So what are they flying into? Did you mention Dallas?
Yeah, I believe they've got one flight a day to DFW and then 3 or 4 to Phoenix Sky Harbor to connect their 2 hubs.
And what kind of aircraft are they flying into DFW?
I believe it's either a 65 or 76 seat RJ, a CRJ 700 or a CRJ 9 or a E170 aircraft.
And is that SkyWest?
It's an American regional affiliate.
American
It
Eagle
might
or
be
something?
SkyWest. It might be Republic. One of the regionals that flies for American.
All right, good.
And at one point, they had actually reached 9 flights a day, and now they're back to the 4 to 5.
4 or 5,
Yeah, so
yeah. And that's, again, all over the country. All over the country that's happening. Very few airports are avoiding this. The ones who are avoiding, I work for Glacier Park, Montana. We have no problem getting airlines up there because it's a huge inbound destination. I work for Hilton Head. They're doing fine. Florida airports are mostly doing wonderful. But if you get away from hot leisure destinations, it's a struggle. It's a big struggle.
I have a question.
Councilmember Roosing.
Thank you. If we have 30-seat jets, will we be increasing the flights, or will we be staying at 1, 2 a day?
Very good question. The DOT is kind of in a pickle right now about this 30-seat product because big EAS cities like Prescott that generate 50,000 people a year. Okay, 2 round trips with a 50-seater, the math kind of works. 2 round trips with a 30-seater is 38,000 seats a year. You got 50,000 passenger demand and 38,000 seats. Not going to work. I am working with the department to see if they will issue the RFP stating 30-seat should be a 3-round trip package, 3-round, and that'll get you 55,000 seats, something like that. So that's one thing we're working on. I don't have an answer as to how they'll handle it because their budget is going like that. The other way we handle it is when the carriers bid, if we get a carrier with a 30-seat bid, we have already planted the seeds with the carriers we know have a 30-seat product that we want 3 round trips in this market. How we arrive at that after bids are in and when you are evaluating which one you want, that'll be a negotiating process. I certainly think we want you at least 3 because just not enough capacity otherwise.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess my question is, it looks like in the short term, there's this intermittent phase of moving from 50 to 30.
The bridging, yeah.
The bridging.
Yeah.
But at some point, I would imagine that 30, it sounds like that 30-seat option is not going to be viable. Like, will there be a divergence into essentially 2 commercial air service markets where, for regionals, where it's very, very small and over 60? And can you speak on that a little bit more?
Well, yeah, the EAS industry and actually air service in small community air service in general in the United States has devolved into it's either a 9-seat airplane or it's an RJ. On the RJ side, 50-seaters are being converted to 30 seats or retired, And then the next step up is the dual class 65, 70, 76 seat RJ. So as the 30 seat aircraft age out, say 8 years from now or something like that, that option's going to go away. There's no manufacturer in the world building a 50-seat airplane right now because they look at the U.S. market and there's no pilots. And you're not going to spend $50 billion to build a new airplane when you're not sure there's pilots for it.
So at some point, we'll face a reality where either they'll have those larger RJs, as you're calling them, in this market, or we'll just have the 9-seat option, essentially.
Yes, it's go up or go down, basically. 10 years from now, 8 years from now, somewhere in that time frame. It's difficult to be exact, but eventually, based on current trends, that's going to be a draconian choice that communities and the DOT are going to have to make.
Thank you.
Mike, considering how the pilot shortage looks to be chronic and ongoing for quite a number of years, have you been involved in any of the discussions about how the Department of Transportation is proposing to solve this problem? I know the 1,500-hour rule created a lot of it.
Yes, sir.
And there's a lot of resistance in altering that.
Yes.
But if they were able to alter that in a safe manner with
Yes.
quality training, it could solve the problem in at least maybe a 3 to 5 year period.
My firm does not specialize in that area. We monitor it very carefully. There are proposals in Congress. There is energy in Congress. There's a variety of things that can happen. The 1,500-hour rule is one thing. More money for young men and women to go to flight school, GI Bill changes, a variety of, extend the retirement age from 65 to 67, which will create a short-term bubble of 2 years where the graybeards, the silver-haired guys and gals won't get out of the airplane. They'll stay for 2 more years. There's various proposals. The demographics of pilot retirement will eventually arc back the other way, and the production curve of new pilots will eventually catch up. But these trends are slow. The younger generation, I sat on a panel in Washington, the flight school, well, hey, this is Prescott. You guys know this from Embry-Riddle. The younger men and women of the newer generation are not as enthralled with flying an airplane as we wish they would be, I guess is what I've heard. So we've got a variety of challenges on this issue, and getting young men and women to see an incredible opportunity is one of them. Churning them out, getting them through, holding on to instructors. As you probably well know in this community, instructors sitting there going, wow, I could get paid $100,000 just to go sign up and fly an RJ. I think I'll do it. And so you lose instructors. So there's all sorts of challenges. And yes, there are actions in Congress, in Washington. There are efforts. Which ones will come to pass, how quickly and how effective, I'm not a topic expert on that.
I think it all depends on the efficiency of the federal government. Anybody holding their breath out there? No.
I will take a moment to praise the DOT Essential Air Service Office. I know those guys and gals very well. They do as public servants, they do a very good job. And I know government's an easy target, but the EAS office, given what they have to balance and what they have to do, in my opinion, as a taxpayer, they do a pretty good job. So.
Councilman Shishka.
Yeah, Mike,
Yes, sir.
a couple of questions. Could we get along without EAS?
Prescott, right now, no. I believe with your growth metrics, GDP, population growth, I could visualize this city a decade from now, 15 years from now, being self-sustaining with large aircraft. I could see it. Can't guarantee it'll happen, but it could happen. But right now, no. I couldn't find an airline to touch Prescott, even with all your positive metrics, without subsidy. Nobody's.
Okay.
Yeah.
My other question is, it certainly seems as though 30-seaters are counterproductive, especially if we extend our runway, our main commercial runway. Why not 70-seaters?
I am trying everything I can to get the people who make those decisions to look at that opportunity. It's right now, American Delta United with their 70-seat aircraft, they're being extremely cautious on where they put them. I can make the best business case I possibly can, and I can't move the needle. So we're trying. I agree with you 100%. I used to do airline planning. I look at EAS as an airline planner, and I'm like, geez, why don't you guys grab this? These are fabulous opportunities. But so far, it's a slog getting the planners at American and United to look at this.
Well, it would certainly seem like we use more pilots on 30-seaters trying to move the same amount of people as we would have less pilots on 70-seaters.
You're preaching to the choir. Now, this 30-seaters, we can use retired captains that can't fly. They're 77 years or 67 years old. And at the same time, we can use first officers that only have 800 hours instead of 1,500. So the 30-seat mechanism doesn't have the same pilot staffing challenges as the dual class.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate your presentation. And I know I've mentioned numerous times how valuable that leakage study that we voted to fund, what was it, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe more, really changed the market here dramatically, because we were able to take that data to SkyWest and show them that there's a legitimate market here in Prescott. And we've been able to take advantage of that since then. But of course, like most things change, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
So just a little follow-up. The next steps are going to be that we should be able to get bids in about 30 days. In the past, what we've done is we worked with Mike to create a spreadsheet. We take it to our airport advisory committee. They will review it, but ultimately you will have to make a recommendation, the council will, on which of the however many bids we get, you would like to bring into this community. You only can pick one. And of course, they may do a variety of locations. It may not just be Denver, LA. It could be a variety of locations. So I want to thank Mike because, he has 70 clients, 70 airports out there, active clients. A third of them are essential air service communities. And he's given us tremendous support. So I really appreciate everything that he's done for us and our community. Thank you.
Thanks again, Mike. We appreciate it. All right, we're going to the next study session item, 3B, discussion and presentation regarding neighborhood vehicular access from design planning code and emergency ingress-egress perspectives.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Chelsea Walton, Interim Community Development Director. So I'm going to give you a brief overview and then turn it over to our speakers. Mr. Scott Lyon will be first up, so I'm giving him a heads up. He'll be up when I'm done here, giving an overview. I'm going to try the clicker. Oh, it's doing the same thing, so I'm going to have that. Oh. Let me just do a test real quick. It's on. Doesn't seem to be working. We'll just give verbal cues then. So staff was asked to coordinate a presentation to council on vehicular neighborhood access. Specifically, there was a concern about a single ingress-egress point for vehicular traffic in neighborhoods. So there's many challenges and design elements that come into play. So staff wanted to provide council a complete picture from raw land and private development development phase through all of the processes and review points at the city. A lot of departments and eyeballs look at this particular issue, so we've kind of sequenced it in succession of events of what typically happens. So the private side, Mr. Scott Lyon, he's a local engineer. He's going to talk about platting from the private side of things. Ms. Tammy DeWitt in community development will present the platting process and review elements from the planning perspective. And then Mr. Ian Mattingly, our traffic engineer with Public Works, will speak to engineering and traffic planning. And Deputy Fire Chief and Fire Marshal Mr. Tom Knapp will speak to the fires review and specific codes related to ingress and egress. And then Fire Chief Mr. Holger Dura, wonderful, will speak to this topic as it relates to fire-adapted communities. So I hope you can see kind of the thread of all the reviews tying together and what everyone looks at when they review one plat. They're all looking at similar things, but from varying perspectives. So I'm hopeful that this will pull everything together for you. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Scott Lyon. And you can stand up here or at the podium, wherever you're most comfortable, sir. Please advance to the next slide. Thank you.
Mayor, council. Might not be on.
It's on. I think the battery died because there was a CEO roundtable in here on Friday and nobody turned anything off. So that's why we're experiencing some issues.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. Scott Lyon, Lyon Engineering, 1650 Willow Creek Road. As Chelsea mentioned, from the private side for access, pros and cons for each side. Excuse me. Looking back over the years of development, you have master plan communities and you have one-shot kind of subdivisions, communities, developments, multifamilies. So basically, within those two categories, size of the land, size of the projects. As mentioned on the slides up there, the checkerboard of public and private lands creates difficulties. So when dealing and trying to get around state lands, you're usually kind of trying to confine those to the corners or the middle to appease state land because they don't like, typically in our meetings with state land department, they don't want to have small, irregular pieces where roads will bisect their property. Much like developers and anybody else, they want to keep large open parcels for development. Existing development within the core of the town, there are limits to access. Many subdivisions are confined to one access point. Some don't have access to other surrounding parcels. And those that do have access, unfortunately, the terrain is not very forgiving. So you'll wind up with roads that either have to be engineered to be meet the 12% grade. Otherwise, it's kind of an unusable secondary access for the fire department. So looking at the factors, it really comes down to, do you have a point of access you can get into when you have an existing piece of property surrounded by development already? We've done a couple where the adjacent access, there was pieces where you could try to tie into, but then there are grade constraints. So it was kind of, there's a point where you can get to it, but to get to it, it's going to be steeper than 12% because the surrounding grade's 20+% coming down the hillside. So there's a lot of pros and cons out there. The best thing that I think over the years that I've seen has been the master plan communities, kind of getting those developments coordinated, tied together. There are regional collector roads, kind of things laid out in process so that way the planning can kind of proceed from the backbones moving forward. And there's points and tie into state land as well. So with the smaller developments, though, I think there's definitely challenges, and that's, I think, the biggest issue I've seen over the past 10 years is just trying to infill those core areas and then trying to get access when you're surrounded by 2 or 3 sides of existing development or private property without access and grades. So hope that was helpful. If there are any questions, please. Oh, sorry.
Hi there. I have a question. Traditionally, we have many neighborhoods on the southwest side of town, which is in our wildland interface urban area for wildfire. And there's one road in and one road out. Cathedral Pines is an example. When the Indian fire happened right at the edge of town, those people had a hard time getting out onto White Spar. And to me, this is a public safety issue, and we just can't keep okaying master plans and designing master plans where there's no egress or ingress for emergencies. We need to have a secondary access. City dedicated street would be nice. I live in a subdivision behind a gate, and it's got one way in and one way out. And there's another adjoining subdivision that has a dirt road that's their access for emergencies, and then my subdivision has a dirt road onto another subdivision and onto Thumb Butte Road. So we just can't keep doing this, and I would just like to make a comment. I feel that a lot of developers, they don't want the secondary road because it takes away a couple of lots and it affects their bottom line. Thank you.
Good question. Okay.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, no worries.
Tammy DeWitt, community planner. So when a project originally comes in, we do a pre-application conference. It gives all the reviewing agencies a time to kind of look over the project, see where it's located, and see what the opportunities are. As Scott said, that most of the projects that we are seeing now are more infill developments, and they do have a lot of terrain issues that limit where they can access or lack of areas to create a secondary access. So what's on the slide now for the first phase that comes in is a preliminary plat. The preliminary plat is what goes through our Planning and Zoning Commission and then comes before the City Council for final approval of that. So things that we do look at adequacy of streets and thoroughfare right-of-way, compliance with the street. But one thing we do really encourage, but we can't require, is that they do look at the secondary access points or opportunities for secondary access points, or if there's a vacant piece of land next door to it, how can we possibly create an access point for that? And we have seen that in a lot of our older subdivisions. Then when the other project comes in and wants to use that secondary access point, then we start seeing the neighbors who already live in those developments are kind of upset. Well, we're going to have additional traffic. It's like, well, that's how we planned this. So when we see the master plans, we plan for all those alternate access points. But then when a project comes in that wants to use that other access point, that's where we're starting to see comments from the other development and the people already live there because they're going to have the additional traffic. Next slide, please. So then the final plat comes in, and that goes through all of our, we look for substantial conformance with the preliminary plat. This is where they kind of can change a couple of things, but there is criteria spelled out in the approved by City Council of what is substantial compliance. So that's what our job is we review and make sure it's in substantial conformance before it comes before you, the City Council, for final approval. And those are usually administrative because the preliminary plat's already been approved by the City Council and Planning and Zoning. So basically the final plat is just coming in with the engineered plans showing that it is doable and they can meet the preliminary plat or they have to amend it. Yes.
Tammy, I just have a question. I know in the last year and a half that I've served on council, there have been examples where a developer has come to a city council meeting for approval of a final plat, and it is in substantial conformance with the preliminary plat, and yet council members have voted against it, even though it meets all of the criteria. And I just want to know, from a council perspective, could you maybe give us some education on, I mean, we're really not allowed to vote against something that is in substantial conformity just because we don't like it, or We wish it had a secondary access. It met fire department approval. It met community development approval. It meets the preliminary plat approval. It conforms the final plat. Can you give us some insight on the obligation we have as elected officials to uphold the law, and that if it's in conformance, we need to vote for it?
Correct. So the preliminary plat is where you really can scrutinize the project, because that's where it's preliminary. We're coming through. This is how they're showing the layout, how it's all going to work. Then once that's approved, in most jurisdictions, the final plat is on a consent agenda. It's not even discussed because you've already approved the preliminary plat. The final plat comes in, it's in substantial conformance. Either there's little tweaks in the layout, lot layout, but it's the same number of lots or less, same access points. If we go to the next slide, this was an example, a great example that George Warrior, planning manager, found that where we had a preliminary plat, so we have the number of lots, we have a cul-de-sac, and we have 3 access points. We have one going east and west, access points out, planned, and then we had another access point to the south. So when the final plat came in, they actually had less lots because once they kind of really dig into it, it's no longer a paper plat, and they kind of can look at more of the terrain. They changed the cul-de-sac, but the number of lots in that area stayed the same. And all the access points, they still had the east-west access points proposed, and then the south access point. So that was in substantial conformance, less lots, but the same access points and number of access points. And that was something that would get approved administratively.
Yeah, I saw that example in the packet when I was looking through it. And I guess my question is there a liability to the council if we vote against something that is in conformance? Could we set ourselves up for either personal or city liability when we say, gee, I don't want to vote for this because I don't like it, even though it conforms with all of the rules and in conformance?
I think that's a legal question.
Yeah, and I'll address that. In terms of liability, and you ask about personal liability, generally not personal liability when you're acting in a role as a legislator. But there potentially could be city liability because what a court would look at is the reasonableness of your actions. And the reasonableness really is set through our zoning ordinances, first of all. And so then we look at preliminary plat, and mainly it's line work in compliance with zoning and all of our various requirements. But from preliminary plat then to final plat, it's substantial conformance. And the city could be looking at liability. And the liability would, and this is a theoretical, this isn't any specific thing. So I don't want to get, but assuming that the preliminary plat was fully legal, that it was approved, that it met all of our codes, and then a final plat came in that was in substantial conformance, there could be a situation where then in a lawsuit we would lose because it's not a reasonable action, because it's in substantial conformance, and then the project could go forward and there could be limited damages.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Tammy, I appreciate what you've said and what Mr. Lyon said as well. I guess knitting together both of the ideas that I've heard so far is that it sounds like the most effective way to achieve good ingress and egress out of the community tends to be, at least from what Mr. Lyons was saying, was a master plan community. That sounds kind of simple. Of course, that's not as easy. That's easier said than done because, as you alluded to, there's a lot of infill that's happening, which doesn't lend itself to that. So the other thing that I'm hearing, I'm asking this to clarify what I'm hearing you say, is that if there's an issue where a member of council or if council as a whole decides, gosh, it just doesn't feel like this is meeting what we would like for a secondary access, the time to raise that objection is at preliminary plat. Am I correct on that?
Correct.
And so when we make those objections, we probably need to be asking people like our traffic engineer or our fire department chief, hey, I have concerns around secondary access. Does this meet the standards of what we have for secondary access? Or, and this is part of the reason why I asked for this topic to come up on study session in the first place, are the current existing, and this will be a question that I'll ask the fire department later, are they adequate to satisfy the concerns that council may express around secondary access? And again, to me, and I've heard Councilman Tenney said this before, at the end of the day, I'm not an expert on fire access for fire department, or, I'm going to turn to, Deputy Chief Knapp or Chief Dura to kind of guide us on, hey, I have concerns around the standards that we have for secondary access in these communities. So I appreciate the clarity, and I just want to make sure. It sounds like really, in an ideal situation, master plan community is kind of the way to achieve good access. Failing that, when we have those concerns, we need to bring it up at preliminary plat.
And usually we bring those up as staff at the PAC meeting, because we can see opportunities at that point of where there potentially could to help direct them or give them direction of what we'd rather see. The doability of that will come with the preliminary plat when they start getting further into the engineering and look at the slopes and stuff. It's the terrain that we're seeing now that's being developed, it's the slope issues. We're seeing that with even just housing developments. All the flat land's developed except up north, and everything else has terrain issues, and they're very difficult and expensive to develop. So we are trying to work with them to do the best planning practices, and we understand everybody's concerns about the secondary access, and we always look at opportunities and encourage them and really push for them to follow that, because it'll make it smoother through the rest of the process and make it a better product.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilman Tenney.
Thank you, Mayor. Just quick piggyback on Mayor Pro Tem Montoya's question. In your professional experience, can you think of times when either in the preliminary or secondary plat approval stage, all of our staff have missed something? It's been missed in planning, it's been missed by the fire department, et cetera, and somebody up on the dais said, well, what about this? Have you thought about this? And you've said, holy smokes, I have not. We totally missed that. Our combined years of experience have just totally let that go. We're sure glad that Clark Tenney put his eyes on that and caught that for us. Is that a common occurrence, or is that a never occurrence, or is that a sometimes occurrence?
Well, you know, I think it comes with experience too, because some of us are newer to the city, may not see something that someone with more experience or 20 years experience may see. But then one example is Pinion Oaks. They did plat some secondary access points for future development, but then the terrain was very steep, and so it's very difficult for fire to say, yes, we can use this secondary access, but we are working with trying to figure out options. We try to catch it as much as possible. We look at the big picture when the project comes in. That's always, as a planner, we look at the big picture. How does this connect? The connectivity, we always want the connectivity between the developments. It makes better planning practice and moves people, and whether in a vehicle or a bicycle or walking, we always want to see that connectivity when it's doable. So
I appreciate that. Very diplomatic answer. Is it just in sum, is it fair to say that there's not a lot of things that we catch that our professional staff have not already caught?
Well, and
That's putting her on the spot.
yeah.
Happens once in a
Once in a
while?
while.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. I think just one additional comment that I want to make on this subject. I think one of the difficulties is for elected officials is oftentimes when we are seeing a final plat approval request, it's for something that was approved in a preliminary plat by a prior council, maybe years previous, and we may not agree with it, but it is in conformance. And so just because we don't agree with it because we weren't involved in that decision-making process when that came to the council originally, that's something that we need to consider.
And we are seeing a lot of that right now because of all the plat rush to get all the preliminary plats for the water allocations. They're starting to come through now, and they may change a little bit, but what we are looking at, do they still meet the substantial conformance? And if they don't, then they have to come back and submit a new preliminary plat, and then we can have a relook at it at that time. But if they're using the original approved preliminary plat, we kind of stuck working with that, and we can do the best we can to try to tweak it and see if there are other opportunities to add that secondary access that wasn't seen before. Or with how the projects, the master plan has developed, there may have been opportunities that were created that wasn't noted before that we see now. There's always an opportunity. We just have, whether we see it or not. Most of the time we are catching it when we can, but then when the terrain, the slope issue, it becomes the problem right now.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's all about public safety. And we live in a tinderbox. So we don't have a land development code that requires a secondary access. Right?
No, we do not. It encourages it.
But we can't legally require a secondary access. And then also, if we don't have a secondary access, we can't even require sprinklers in all the homes, right? Sprinklers can only be required in like part of the homes of a subdivision.
And I will defer that next to fire. Who's next? That's a great, Ian said, sorry. That is a great segue, though, to what the fire will be talking about. But next we have Ian talking about the design standards for the subdivisions.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Hi, Tammy. Oops, is this on? It doesn't sound like it is. Okay. Tammy, I've had that happen on 3 separate projects where what happens is you pay people, and Clark, this is to your comment, you pay people for a topo map. Have you seen that a lot of those grade issues go away now that we have drones? Because I know in the past we didn't have the capacity to, maybe set up a transit and find out what the grade is ahead of time before you go to the plan stage. And sometimes you show up and start the project and oops, it's wrong. And I know that you've referred to that in the past, but with the drones now coming on the picture, has that helped at all?
Not that I know of, but as a city of Prescott, we have great topo maps.
Mm-hmm.
We have it for the city, what we've paid for, which is actually better that we don't share it with the county, where we have developers asking all the time for topo information from us, and we're always providing it, and it's updated every few years. So we actually have really great topo information in our GIS mapping.
Just making sure that gets passed into the architectures.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, very good. Thank you, Tammy. I know that the Hidden Hills development has always been of concern to me. When that was originally planned, there was a secondary access on the eastern part, actually the western part of the development, and then there was a small access alley or lane between Pinion Oaks and the eastern part of the development, but I think it was too narrow to really be utilized for fire truck access.
My understanding, and from fires looking at that right now, they have driven it to see about the slope. It's all about the slope.
It's a big slope.
Yeah.
I was out there last weekend, and that phase 1 is about ready to start building, I think. They've got the roads in, they've got sidewalks, they've got curbs, utility boxes are there. So that's pretty ready to go, I would think, and trying to deal with that. I think the other proposal was once Westwood is fully built out, then there may be a access road from that phase 1 kind of northeast into that area.
Yes.
But is that a legitimate way to plan a development by saying, well, in the future, if things work out, we might be able to have a secondary access road?
Well, we do that all the time when we plan the stub outs on the plat, so there's an opportunity. But like I said, then that subdivision gets built out, and those people that live close to that, those 2 or 3 houses, then when this other development comes in and wants to use that secondary, then we hear the complaints from the people that live in the existing development. That's what we're hearing right now, starting to come out.
Have we thought about maybe putting in signage in those areas by saying this is a future access road for ingress, egress, and that way the neighbors can say, I didn't know about that.
It's recorded on the plat. So, I mean, that's a legal document that they should, if they want to look at when they're buying a piece of property, look at the plat and see what's planned for that area. If you live on a cul-de-sac adjacent to a vacant piece of property, maybe that's something you should look at, is the plat, to see if there was something planned on that before.
Yeah, I thought that was rather interesting on the west side of that development when they originally had that secondary access road. I walked that, and it was not that steep of a slope, but it was going into a county development rather than a Longview. So is that more of a consideration for that than actually the slope in itself?
I don't, was it the terrain? Was it the slope? Was the issue with that one? Yeah, it was the slope and the county that trying to get the agreements with the county, because I think it went into a dirt road, if I remember
Yeah,
right.
it was a dirt road.
Yeah. So.
Well, let's just remember that we help pay for that roundabout, so the next time it comes up, let's call in that chip. Thank you, Tammy.
You're welcome.
Live down the road.
Okay.
You can advance the slide. Good afternoon, Ian Mattingly, City Traffic Engineer. I'll try to talk into the mic. So obviously we've been going through different perspectives. This is going to be from the perspective of Public Works. This doesn't entail all that we do because I'm just looking at it from the access roadway kind of connectivity side, not all the things that all the various reviewers do. But primarily, when we're looking at plats, so this is the plat process. So we're going to include preliminary and final plat because obviously, as Tammy just said, once we're through that preliminary plat process, we've kind of got everything. We should have everything hammered out so that we know the roadway system, it doesn't change substantially, and that we can just move to final approval once we get there. But we're looking at 4 basic things as we look at these, and that is the compatibility with the future roadway network, so roadway planning, review of the type and size of the roadways that they're going to be constructing, the developer, and see if they're appropriate. We're going to ensure that the design elements of the system conform to our GSs, and that would kind of bleed over into the some of the land development code as well, because it has discussion regarding connectivity, access, block widths, things like that. And then lastly, we're going to confirm that the proposed roadway system will perform adequately. So that's the things that we do. Next slide, please. So one of the first things done when we're reviewing the plat is we're determining whether the roadway layout that they're proposing and the connection points that we see, because remember, the private side developer like Scott Lyon or any developer, master plan or otherwise, they own the land, they best know the topography, they know what they're building. Is it a subdivision? Is it got commercial? What does it have? And they're going to optimize their land within the parameters of our regulations, and they can do that. So we just need to determine whether the layout that they've given and the connection points that they've proposed are compatible with any known future roadway alignments, desired connection points that we may have, or planned intersections. So these planned roadways are typically part of transportation documents like the Central Yavapai Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm going to say SIMPO from now on, SIMPO, the Regional Transportation Plan. So we know where regional roads should go. So in the cases where you might have a master plan community that are being built on there and they're platting, we obviously want to make sure we're reserving roadway corridors, or if they're building it, that it aligns with what we thought where it should be. If there are intersections that we know of that are contained in these things might be contained in the general circulation element of the general plan. They might be part of a development agreement that was agreed to in the past. That happens. Or there could be other ways that those things are planned or known.
Councilman Moore, you have a question?
Yeah, anytime.
I'm probably interrupting your presentation. I apologize, but I recall just a few months ago we had a discussion, and you were here, where we were talking about Peregrine Point,
yes,
off of Smoke Tree, and if I remember correctly, we were looking at a preliminary plat, and we had quite a bit of discussion because I brought up access, and we talked about the possibility of a light, and we talked about exiting through Astoria, but I felt like in that presentation, we weren't given a final answer. It was a discussion, but there wasn't a decision. And so I guess my concern is when it comes back as a preliminary plat, is it going to be locked in to what we saw, and we didn't get that secondary access, or we didn't get that light. I just felt like it wasn't completed in that instant when we were looking at the preliminary plat for that particular project. So I'm just raising that concern.
Sure. So, I mean, that's a good example of a location where staff, we basically have known for many years, and the roadway on Prescott Lakes was designed to have a signal at Smoke Tree. So staff on the Public Works end knows that when something ever comes down there, Peregrine Point, or the secondary portion of, is it Astoria, the secondary phases of that, we knew that that would need to access at that defined intersection point. And then that would then support the intersection being constructed, and those things would go forward. So those would be the things that we're looking at. When that comes through, that's exactly what we catch. We say that Astoria was stubbed with an access point into the secondary phase to access the signal that was up at the top of the hill. And then if they want to propose an access down onto the future extension of Smoke Tree along with Peregrine, then that would be appropriate as well. That would fit a lot of what Fire wants. That would fit a lot with what move traffic very well. So from a Public Works standpoint, that's what I expect to see, and that's what we will require. That's what we require, that there will be a connection point at Smoke Tree, there will be participation in a signal, that if Astoria wants to plug in their access, and I believe they are, and come out to Smoke Tree Extension, that will be there as well. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for and
I appreciate
would
that.
be requiring.
Yeah, I guess I just didn't feel like at the end of the presentation I felt comfortable that that was finalized, that was the decision, because I felt like we were looking at a preliminary plat and there was a discussion about these other entrances, but it wasn't like part of that plat. It was just a discussion.
Yeah, and I don't recall, was that preliminary plat approved to at that time, or was it, I'm sorry that, yeah.
It was.
I think it was.
Yeah, so for instance, for it to be in substantial conformance, when it comes back, it can't be modified from there, or it will be, it will not be out, it would be out of conformance in my opinion, and I would certainly raise those concerns with the planning group. And so they would bring that back to you, and we would have an issue.
Yeah, and my issue wasn't the preliminary plat. My issue was egress.
Yes, all those things that go along with it. Yes.
Not the plat itself.
Sure.
It's
the external things of that access points.
Yes.
Yes. So those are what we're looking for, though, and we use these long-range kind of transportation documents and things to catch those. So if future roadways do impact a plat, if we do a review and find out, hey, they're going to put something that does impact a future roadway, a connection point that we have planned, then we require maybe a right-of-way corridor dedication, or we direct them to align certain roadways or intersections at certain points. Additionally,
Councilmember Rusing, you had a question?
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to go back to, could you explain the role of the HOAs in these, like, for example, in Prescott Lakes? And are they invited to participate in the conversations involving egress and ingress?
So by the time it comes to us, it's a plan submittal by development with a preliminary, they're developing a preliminary plat submittal. At that point, I'm not aware of staff reaching out to HOAs to get some type of involvement. I would think a lot of times what I think is happening is that when there's a sensitive issue, like some of the issues around Prescott Lakes are certainly sensitive. I think they, there's a planning process that goes to maybe a rezoning or they're platting. They'll notice the land. That gives legal notice that the neighbors should see or will be notified. And then I think that gives them the opportunity to at least know about that, come and then express their views. But on the review side of Public Works, we don't specifically have meetings with HOAs to get involvement or input. If that was the case, honestly, I would say that we get varying opinions, and most people probably wouldn't want most projects. I mean, Pinion Oaks, that connection has been there for many years, and those people probably received plats that showed that that was an access point. And yet when it came to it, if it's for the good of fire connection and the good of traffic movement, I think most people aren't going to care because they're going to trump that with personal opinions regarding vehicular traffic by their home. So that would be challenging to review things that way. So I think that's how they're noticed, through that legal process.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Ian, it's my understanding that in a new plat, an HOA actually doesn't take over until the plat and the ownership is at 75% capacity. So really the engineering is all the way up to the developer, and he has to do that. They don't get to supersede the engineering for these planned area developments. So the HOA can't even get involved in it until the plat is built out and occupied at 75% of the planned area development. But they would have nothing to do with it anyway. And plus, if it's an existing pad and you do an additional pad next to it, and they are now grouped into the existing HOA, they would have received the CC&Rs at purchase of that lot. So, but that has nothing to do with he's talking about engineering. That's all through the engineering firm that's hired.
Thank you. Next slide. So the next thing that we look at is we've looked at the overall alignment of the roads and where they're making connections. We've kind of tried to catch any major regional type of things or connection points. But then we also look at the right-of-way to ensure that the proper roadway typical section is being selected that would provide enough width, match with our classification designations for our roadways. We might look at other elements like utilities, cut and fill, a myriad of things for the roadway system itself. And then we would also then look at the general engineering standards so that we can confirm that we talked about grades. You keep hearing topography, grades, and things like this. The developer is free to make the roads, put them where they want to and do all the things so long as they conform with the requirements of our geometrics. So we don't drive their design, we just give them the limits in which they must at least adhere. So we have, like, if it's local streets in a subdivision, they have to, hit 12%. And then their vertical curves have to be certain distances. But if they can make the road do all kinds of things that might not make most sense to me, but meet the requirements and do everything, and then they have access points that don't negatively come into a connection right opposite another intersection, that might be bad. We wouldn't want to see that. But as long as they do that, they are free to lay out the development as they want. Next slide. But so we don't typically also set the number of access points that are required. I can tell you that we do not do that. So from a public works side, I don't come into a thing saying they have to have 2, they have to have 3, they have to have so many. If it's a large development, so long as they meet our standards of the geometrics, and then they typically would do a traffic study, so long as the roadway can handle the traffic and the intersections can handle the movements at a good level of service and in a safe way, they then have freedom to put those where they want so that they can optimize the lot and do all those things that we would want to do if it was our land. So that's now larger developments do TIAs, smaller developments might not do that. And then we would give them guidance on maybe where to do that. Now, let's say we're dealing with just a small subdivision that wanted to put 3 access points. We might control them through limiting the number of accesses they could have, because that could be a negative as well. But one of the things that's highlighted on the screen is that emergency access and evacuation from the public works side is not typically considered. So we are not driving, hey, you have to have that back access, because fire is a reviewer, and fire will be providing that discussion with them about a secondary chained access or sprinklers if they meet those criteria, and they'll speak to that more. But I just want you to know that from our standpoint, we don't go in with this preconceived notion that you have to have 2 or you have to have 3. And we don't also, if they build cul-de-sacs, the LDC says you can't have cul-de-sacs longer than this, you can't have block lengths longer than that. That controls a lot of what they do, and so you end up seeing a lot more streets and connection points. But as long as they don't negatively impact our future long-term plans, they have connection points that work operationally and in a safety standpoint, they're free to have freedom. So that's really, from my standpoint, what's going on with Public Works. If you have questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. Fire's going to come up and then get into the nitty-gritty.
Councilmember Rusi.
Thank you, Ian. So just let me make a philosophical statement. So you're the traffic engineer, but you believe that from your point of view, public safety should be left in the hands of the developer and not in the traffic engineering department.
So what I would say is that, and we talked about this because we kind of discussed the fact that we're all coming from different review periods, we have different things to look at. I think I personally think there needs to be a decision. These are like policy decisions. If you want to say that this is an important thing for the community, then possibly you need to look at maybe the land development codes or the standards and implement something that can be enforced by both fire and all of us. Now, I'm not trying to lead the discussion on that, but the LDC, the Land Development Code, sets a lot of regulations regarding you should do this, you should have connectivity, you should stub to a thing. There isn't language in there currently that we can find that says you should consider secondary routes for evacuation purposes that I could see. So I don't think it's a public works thing. I don't know that it's just a fire thing. I think it's a city policy kind of decision, and you could modify maybe the appropriate documents, and then we could all maybe catch it at different points.
It's hard.
That's my input.
It's hard to enforce a code you don't have.
Yeah, and so I'm not saying it's appropriate or not, or what other communities do, but that's how you would probably do that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else for me?
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Ian. My question, I guess, and I think this is probably more for fire who's about to come up. So, but to your point about that policy decision around evacuation points, and generally, and part of what my hope in bringing this topic forward was that there could be some dialogue about what are the opportunities that exist for potential revision of the Land Development Code, and is it necessary? And I guess that's part of the question is, to your point, I think some of this is a policy decision, but at the same time, I think policy decisions have to be driven by best practices too. Is it a best practice? What are the, and I've talked to the fire chief about this before, where when we were first talking about this topic, we could go in and say, we're going to demand secondary access in every single new development that happens in this community. But what that practically will have as an impact is that it will make development in this community more expensive. Well, what are the implications of that? Suddenly housing becomes more expensive. Suddenly we've just shot ourselves in the foot around workforce housing when we're trying to actually alleviate that problem. So I do think that there's some balance that needs to be achieved with this. We can't come in with a draconian approach and be really heavy-handed about this. We have to think about what best practices are. And in my mind, not every neighborhood or development in this community requires the same benchmarking for secondary access. And so I know the fire department's going to come up. I would hope that maybe you could speak to some of that.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Good afternoon. Tom Knapp, Deputy Chief and Fire Marshal. And I think you're ready for me. So, first of all, the folks that were here before me, they've kind of taken their piece of the discipline, and that's what it is. It's a discipline it's their area of expertise, and we all work together to try to get the same common goal. Now, as you heard, we have codes, we have ordinances, they've all been passed, they've been vetted through the council to get approved, but they don't cover every aspect of what we'd like to see. But what we would call practical or prudent isn't always possible. And we have to think of that when we look at our terrain, topography that we're trying to, especially in the infill. It's very hard to go back and put in a street standard of today, what was improved or approved back in the 40s. Totally different outlook. It's based on experience, events that took place between now and then, and what drove our decisions, such as the wildfires, the WUI. All of the wildland urban interface codes have come up over the last 30 years, and they developed and they've gotten stronger. And then with crisis, with the economy, we lose our strength in those codes because we want to back down on them. And then we get results of what we saw in the last couple of years in New Mexico and Colorado. And we have to put those into play. To speak about our topography, that's what we're looking at. When it comes down to a flat plat, it's very simple, it's very easy. We have the folks that put this together and talk about it. We had Scott talk about how they look at their land. Every inch of ground is money. And we know that. All of us know that. How we utilize that space and how it fits into the city is why we're here. We want to keep the continuity. We want to keep the flow. We want to keep it desirable. And how do we do that? Do we pave all the streets and put red markers and make them fire lanes? No, we don't. We can't do that. It's not practical. And pretty soon it's like something in front of your face all the time and you forget to read it. No boats at Lower Goldwater Lake. Watched a guy put one right in front of the sign. I've never seen that before. We become, I guess, blind to what's right in front of us because we live with it so long. So my list of items have been really covered. The fire department covers a lot of ground, but not all of these things listed here do we have control over. They're in other disciplines around here, and they take great pride in their work. Now, we'll have our discussions in the back trying to get a general engineering standard that meets the fire department access requirements and get that done, so it's always there. But our infill lots were approved and platted, and now we have a standard on driveways that we can't get a fire truck up to serve a 5,000 square foot house at the top of the hill. And now you have an owner of the property 2 or 3 generations down that it was handed down. Now we can afford to build. We want to move to Prescott. And when it comes to the fire review, we're building a road that looks like a serpentine just to get the grades up that costs more than the house. We have some challenges, and when I first came here almost 2 years ago, I said these are things that we need to address. We need to try to standardize how we deal with these so that it's not a mystery when you come in. They are individual. No 2 lots are alike, I can assure you of that. But when it comes down to grade and what we do to compensate those, we've gone as far as you put sprinklers in, you put platforms here, even to the point where we can't offer the same type and level of response to neighbors because of the grade difference. In the winter, everything changes. We've had a long winter. We have a technical rescue team, which is, we're fortunate because of the topography. But that's how we have to get patients out of the house because we can't get a fire truck up or we can't get an ambulance up. So that drives our decision-making process. So that's the bigger picture. But I'll go over the key elements. We're looking at the same thing, that planning looks at. They've done all the hard work for us. But we look at it as a second set of eyes to see if it meets what we can do. Because there's always things that we get tunnel vision on. We do the same thing. And we like to have a different perspective. The joint operation that we have through the PAC, the ability of all of the disciplines to sit with the development and have a discussion on, hey, these are the topics that we look at. We can send a boilerplate every single time. But when you get a developer that's designing these, they pretty much know those. They've read the criteria. They're going to get the most out of the lot. Where are you going to put your road? It's not going to be down here. It's going to be at the top because I can service 2 sides of the mountain I want to sell. That poses a problem. Now that we're up here, how do we get down here? So some of the plats that were talked about, they look good in a 2-dimensional aspect. And then you start looking at them and working them, and then you try to get a fire truck down it. It doesn't work. I've had phone calls recently from a property owner that doesn't want to put sprinklers in. His secondary access is blocked. It's recorded. Now that comes back to us. Well, we don't know whether, and we'll push that one aside, but I've had other ones where they have completely closed off the secondary egress to the properties, to a manufactured home site, park. That poses challenge. It's a recorded area. How do we deal with that? It's on private property. It happened years and years ago. There's a ton of legal issues with some of this stuff because it wasn't followed. The challenge also comes is it wasn't wide enough to begin with in some cases. So how do we fix those? And it goes back to everything we're looking at, main thoroughfares. How do we connect? Is it safe? That's Ian's piece. I'm not going to tell you how far a driveway access goes to a main road. There's a safety engineering standard for that. Ours is, can we get in? Can we get out? And most of these secondary accesses that you see that are dirt roads are all about local area fire-wise to get out. How do we get out of Thumb Butte? And they work out those agreements. The tough thing is, are they recorded? This year we abandoned one fire lane on a ridge that had no access point. It was signed with the city ordinance, no blocking fire lane, but there was no way to get to it. It was in somebody's backyard, 4 lots. And the intent, as far as we could tell in the original plat, was to use that as the main drive and drop down to the houses because you couldn't go up from the bottom. Somehow that made it through, and that abandonment only made sense. So if we can go to the next slide, because I don't have control. We also look at vegetation concerns. Back to the topography. We're building on hillsides because that's going to be the land that's available. It's going to be the maximum benefit to the developer to sell those lots. But can you do that without a secondary access? Yes, you can. One of the things that the fire codes and the WUI code that's adopted by the city is that defensible space and maintenance of that vegetation. We're going to look at how we affect access, homeowners, emergency services, and we talked about that a little bit. The point of access, what does that look like? It's usually the first approach because you're at a dead stop and you have to approach. So we want a lower grade at that first approach, and then we can slowly go up. We're going to look at the density, which is the same as the next point. How many homes, how many units? What's the population that we're going to be serving there? Because that determines the type of fire force and response capabilities. We have to get to that point. If we're building Touchmark with a single access road, that could be a problem. But the roadway and the roadway structure and the water systems and the construction is designed to support that kind of infill or that infrastructure up there. Phasing, this is one of the areas that I think has come up several times with some of the plats and sitting in council to watch these. They were approved and went through before I got into the position. So I saw them for the first time, as some of you did, and got to look at them. There are phasing of continuous roads, a secondary access or a main thoroughfare or secondary thoroughfare going through, connecting the different subdivisions. However, the landowner doesn't know the piece he wants to connect through. Now that's a problem when you approve a plat and you say this can happen, but nobody owns the land that's in the discussion. So those are one of the areas that I'm concerned about, because how do you go back and get it? One of the big developments that I was involved in a long time ago was Anthem. And part of that was a single access, and it came from the west side of I-17. Now, that was a 4-lane bridge crossing with freeway access. And the challenge was fire protection. How do you get it in there? Where's the water going to come from? So with a lot of work and roadway mapping, we approved a secondary temporary access through 7th Avenue or 7th Street. And then when the development hit 2,000 homes, they had to have a second off-ramp onto I-17. And that came about 10 years ago, finally. So that tells you how long that took and how long that development was in play. I think that's it. I'll try to take your questions.
Thanks, Tom. I think speaking to Councilman Moore's concerns, like that Peregrine development by Astoria, where we're approving a preliminary plat with the expectation that there's going to be a signalized intersection to connect that. But the preliminary plat doesn't require that intersection to be created. But we're approving the preliminary based upon the expectation that it will be. But who knows, years later, when the when the other council comes to approve the final plat, they don't realize that the expectation was that there was going to be a signalized intersection there. And the developer can say, well, my preliminary plat is in substantial conformance, so therefore you have to approve my final. And I get to build it that way. So it seems like there should be an approval subject to the creation of that intersection that's related to that. But I don't think we have that option at the moment.
Mayor, members of the council, I'm not aware intimately with the development code, so I would pass that for them. That's their forte. That's what they do, is development agreements and development planning as a whole, and expectations when they bring a plat to you. I would agree that there are substantial changes that come, and I think Tammy spoke of those, that they would trigger another review if they're substantially different than what was originally approved. The key element is the design of the plat, from my perspective, and the density of that plat is going to drive the roadway construction. And that is where Streets gets in there and helps design that and make sure that flow meets it. I hope that answers it from my perspective.
Yeah, I just see that there's overlapping responsibility and authority here, but sometimes they don't connect together. And then you end up in the future with a development that's actually pretty risky. And of course, most of us followed the disaster in California at the city of Paradise up there, where they had neighbors that didn't want an access road, an egress, and then the people could not get out. And it was a conflagration that caused massive property damage and a lot of deaths. And I certainly don't want to ever see the city of Prescott have to deal with that and then say, why didn't they consider that when these areas were approved for building? You know, it's almost like the number of warrants needed before you get an intersection. It's like, how many wrecks do you have to have? Does somebody have to die in it before we can get a safety decision made? And I don't ever want to see that happen in the city of Prescott. So sometimes we have to anticipate what is, to Mayor Pro Tem's point, being able to require some reasonable alternative requirements that don't end up generating huge costs. But we still need to consider those reasonable alternatives.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I would say that the fire department is one of those advocates that's always looking to take it a little bit further, and we get pulled back into that box because the codes don't allow it or don't speak of it. And I think Chief Dura will go into this a little bit. We are running out of time, so
We are.
He did tell me 2 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
He can
Thank
dance
you,
better than
Tom.
I can. I know that. Thank you.
All right, next slide. Okay. So I'm wearing a tie, and hopefully I'm bringing a solution today rather than just asking for money. So this is a little bit of an opportunity for us to talk about fire-adapted communities, and we have a work session on that on June 13th for you, specific to this concept. But I want to just give you a preview of what that looks like. A little bit of history. The fire-adapted communities is one of 3 parts of the National Cohesive Wildfire Management Strategy. And fire-adapted communities really take what we've done here in Prescott and really expand on it. So for instance, FireWise is one of those components. And if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to walk you through really what we're talking about here in terms of ingress and egress out of a neighborhood, because everybody here has articulated pretty clearly that this takes a cohesive, multidisciplinary approach in order to achieve the outcome of public safety. That's really what we're after, right? So fire-wise and resident responsibility, we talk about that quite a bit. There is resident responsibility. We could build a neighborhood as safe as anything, and then if vegetation does not get managed in that neighborhood, that public safety concern comes back. Next slide. Obviously, we need to talk about evacuation planning. Evacuation planning right now primarily is centered with the county in terms of when we have to do ready, set, go orders. But there's also city code and policy that influence our authority, legal authority with the police department, city manager, and the mayor to order evacuations in case that were to happen. And I do want to really quickly there pause on this, because fire-adapted communities make one assumption: we're living with wildfire. I think sometimes the common perception that we can somehow prevent every event from ever happening is false. We live in a landscape that has wildfire as an integrated part of that. And so it's really, how do we adapt to live in that kind of a community? Next slide. So obviously that goes right into community awareness. We need everyone living here in this community to be aware of exactly what I just said, that we live in a fire-adapted wildfire community, and wildfire is a part of what we deal with every day. Next slide. Obviously, those landscape treatments that we really need to think about, we've mentioned some of that with the forestry crew and what we do with the Forest Service as well as the state to make sure that we manage the landscape. You can't really just, again, at the neighborhood level even, prevent conflagrations from traveling through. We've seen this. We mentioned Paradise recently in Boulder with the Marshall Fire, same kind of an idea where neighborhoods, plural, were impacted by wildfire events. So it really has to be a community-wide wildfire treatment event. Next slide. And then finally, here we are, right? Plans and regulations. But if you have plans and regulations that don't take into consideration the other components of this fire-adapted community model, you can't come up with a regulation that in and of itself will solve this problem. It all has to interface and interconnect. And I think a lot of the questions that you asked are a lot of the conversations that we have at the staff level as well. And so there is definitely that alignment and the congruence. And I'm looking forward in June, again, to take a little bit deeper dive with this, because this, in my opinion, is really where we need to go. Again, this was published in about 2009 on a national level, so it's fairly new and fairly young, and it's time for us to get started on this work. All of these sectors have to come together, from public health to resident awareness, wildfire response. They all have to come together, and in and of itself, not a single regulation can solve really the bigger macro level problem. So that's what we had in terms of fire adapted communities. If you have any questions for any of us, we're happy to take those.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, and this is for everyone who came and presented, I want to thank you for putting together a really detailed and very beneficial, and for me at least, educational presentation. And I guess the only direction that I would provide is that if there are opportunities to modify land development code that would increase public safety or increase, traffic circulation, or if there's vulnerabilities that exist within our land development code, I don't think anyone up here has the expertise to identify that. In a lot of ways, we're dependent upon staff to kind of do that work for us. And so I would personally love for all the folks that are involved in this multidisciplinary process to look at it and say, hey, City Council, here's what we've identified as a vulnerability that we have, and here's our thoughts on maybe a couple different approaches to find a solution. And I have a lot of trust in all of you that came up here to do that work. So thank you for your participation today.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I just want to say congratulations, Chief Dura, on approaching your 1-year anniversary here in Prescott.
Yes.
And hopefully we won't have another forest fire for you this summer like we did last summer.
That would be my preference as well. Yes.
But seriously, I was just going to ask you about your opinion of our sprinkler code where we allow homes with just one ingress to an egress to not have sprinklers?
So one thing to keep in mind with all codes, the building code, the WUI code, our fire code, is it is the minimum standard to assure public safety. We in the code set don't have by itself the maximum standard written into those on purpose. And so those regulations that you speak of are meant to collaborate with the other code sets, and they've taken into consideration things like the cost of development, other policies that it might impact. I think it's very difficult for me to opine simply in and of itself around that without the greater contextual conversation, because there's a lot that goes into it. Residential sprinklers do save lives. That is proven. However, how those are implemented and how those are rolled out is extremely important. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right, well, thank you very much, Chief.
Yep.
I think, as the Mayor Pro Tem indicated, we had some very valuable information presented today. Something that we can consider, and we look forward to your more thorough presentation. I think it's in June, as you mentioned. So it's now 2:56. If everybody here is in attendance is okay with that, I think the council would like to take maybe a 10-minute bio break. So we'll reconvene the voting session at 3:05. So this study session is adjourned.